Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mayor Jeff Lehman of the City of Barrie, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar today, a series of webinars that are addressing multifaceted dimensions of the opioid crisis and the broader root causes that have led to and can inform us in fighting this very human tragedy that is affecting Ontario communities and Canadian cities, and in fact cities across the world. I am going to make a few opening remarks, but first it's very important that we acknowledge the land on which many of us are sitting today and that this webinar is occurring on. We acknowledge the meeting is taking place on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe people. The Anishinaabe include the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. We are dedicated to honoring Indigenous history and culture and committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation with all Métis, Inuit, and First Nations people. As mayor of the City of Barrie, I have seen firsthand the impacts, the very rapid and devastating impacts of opioids in our community. But I'm very conscious, even as we have begun to try and respond over the past few years through public health, through emergency services, through enforcement, through education, that the root causes of the opioid crisis often occur much earlier in life. And I said at the outset that this is a very human tragedy, and that is because its causes are themselves very human. And while much attention is paid, and rightly, to the urgent need to address the lives being lost weekly to poison drugs, if we are taking a thoughtful and comprehensive response, we must understand the reasons for addiction in the first place. And the science on this continues to expand, and there is tremendous work being done here in Canada. So it is a very great pleasure today to bring some opening remarks to a webinar that is addressing one of these huge areas of development in terms of our understanding of the root causes, and that's the Neuroscience of Resilience, which is the title of today's webinar, and we're delighted to have Dr. Sherren as our guest speaker today. I don't want to steal any of her thunder or Claudia's as the Master of Ceremonies, if you will, today, but I do want to welcome everybody. And again, we had a webinar 10 days ago on opioids in our community, and it was attended by over 300 people, and I can see our attendees list now is just over 125 for today's seminar, addressing just one facet of this very broad problem. And so thank you to all of you who are here, regardless of whether you work in fields addressing the impacts of the crisis, or whether you are an interested observer or somebody, unfortunately, who has had that direct experience with the consequences of this crisis. We're all here for the same reason, because we want to be part of solutions, and solutions begin with understanding the causes. And I believe today will give us another and very important perspective on that. So with that, thank you all for attending, and thank you particularly to our organizers and the Simcoe-Muskoka District Health Unit for the tremendous work that you are doing in leading the Simcoe-Muskoka opioid strategy in combating this very human crisis. And with that, I will hand it over to Claudia.
Thank you very much, Mayor Lehman. Before I get into today's presentation, we have just a couple of housekeeping items. So just to let people know, this webinar is being recorded. Cameras are off and lines are muted, other than for the presenters, of course. Though there will be an opportunity for people to ask questions, and please feel free to ask questions throughout, but we'll be addressing the questions following Dr. Sherren's presentation. So you can just enter your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to address as many questions as we possibly can towards the end of the webinar. So we may be looking at grouping some of the questions in order to get through them all. So as we begin the webinar, I would like to acknowledge the City of Barrie has been very committed to addressing the challenges that the community is seeing around harmful substance use, including addictions, and what we have been witnessing in Barrie around the opioid crisis, as Mayor Lehman has identified. In doing so, they've partnered with the Simcoe-Muskoka District Health Unit, the Simcoe-Muskoka Opioid Strategy, and Georgian College in bringing this webinar to us all in the community today. And I'd like to thank everyone from the community, including community members and health and social service providers who have registered for this webinar today. I think it really speaks to the interest and commitment in addressing this complex multifactorial issue associated with harmful substance use and looking at how we can collectively address that together as a community. Now, the prevention, just to give you a little bit of context and background, the prevention pillar of the Simcoe-Muskoka Opioid Strategy, as part of its work plan, is committed to working with community partners around the root causes of addictions and recognizes that there are many pathways to harmful substance use, including addictions. And we would like everyone to please keep that in mind as we move through today's presentation with Dr. Sherren. So today's presentation will focus primarily on, as Mayor Lehman has identified as well, is a root causes perspective of it. So root causes contributing to harmful substance use as it pertains to adverse childhood events and toxic stress through building resilience at the individual, family, and the community level. Dr. Sherren will address not only one of these very significant pathways to harmful substance use and addictions, but we'll look at how we begin to unpack the information in a way that allows us to move forward in a positive way by building on our strengths, building relationships and connections with our community. And in so doing, building resiliency, which really is a significant piece in moving forward. We're very honored and pleased to have Dr. Sherren with us today. Dr. Sherren has a Ph.D. in neuroscience from Carleton University in Ottawa and was awarded the inaugural Alberta Heritage Foundation for Medical Research Neuroscience in Canada Research Fellowship, which she held at the Canadian Centre for Behavioral Neuroscience, University of Lethbridge from 2004 to 2007. Her research expertise includes experience-based brain development, neurodevelopment disorders, and brain plasticity. In 2007, Nicole left academia and joined the Palix Foundation to focus on mobilizing the science of early brain development, adverse childhood experience, and resilience into public policy and professional practice. Over her tenure with Palix, she developed and led strategies to spread and embed the science within the education, healthcare, justice, and nonprofit sectors. She has worked directly with service providers and policymakers to help them achieve their goals around mobilizing and applying the science in their workplaces and has gained a deep understanding of the challenges facing each sector, as well as the levers to incent and create change within individuals, organizations, and systems as a whole. There's much more I could go on to share about Dr. Sherren's accomplishments, but I think we want to spend some of that time in hearing Dr. Sherren speak. So without any further ado, welcome, Dr. Sherren.
Thank you so much, Claudia and Mayor Lehman, for those wonderful remarks. It's my pleasure to be here with all of you today to talk about the neuroscience of resilience. And I'm just going to begin by sharing my screen and calling up a deck of slides here for you. There we go. So what I want to do today is unpack more about what we've learned in the past, let's say 20 or so years about the concept of resilience and how this is really a brain-based concept. We now know that resilience is not just a trait of certain lucky people. It's actually a skill and ability that can be built over time. And so I'm going to unpack sort of three core concepts around resilience for you and talk, as Claudia had mentioned, about adversity both in childhood as well as in adulthood, and how that potentially affects our capacity for resilience over time. And we will have some time for questions at the end. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on all of this as the presentation unfolds. So the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about how people used to think about resilience. Resilience first started being researched back in the 1970s in the field of psychology. And there was this one seminal paper, which unfortunately I couldn't get a copy of because papers that old are typically not digitized. But they really outlined resilience as a key trait of certain people. And they called it resilience as being like an invulnerable child. So they said there are a number of different types of children that are kind of like dolls. Some children are made of steel. If you take a hammer and tap on that steel doll, well, it doesn't break. Some children are more like plastic dolls. If you take a hammer and tap on that plastic doll, there'll be a little bit of damage, but nothing too major. And some children are like glass dolls. If you tap that with a hammer, the doll will shatter into a million pieces and you can't possibly put it back together again. And this really didn't leave a lot of space to think about resilience as something that can be built and grown. And that's where that neuroscience that started really back in sort of the mid to late 1990s and into the 2000s came along and really helped change our understanding of resilience. So we now think about it, I'm calling here sort of like resilience 2.0, thinking about it more as an outcome, so a positive outcome in the face of negative experiences, as well as a dynamic capacity and skill that can be built over time. So when you think about resilience in these ways, it's often helpful to think about it as being kind of like a scale, which you see here in front of you, where you've got positive supports and experiences on one side of the scale. These are things like, adequate nutrition, sleep, physical activity, as well as supportive relationships, supportive environments. And those are weighing down that positive arm. They're also counterbalanced, though, by the negative experiences that we know that all of us, to a certain extent, will experience in our lives. Chaotic environments growing up, not having some of those really supportive relationships, perhaps being in abusive relationships, living in poverty, not having access to healthcare. And then the last component of resilience is the tipping point or the fulcrum on the scale here. And you can think about that as kind of like the basic biology that we're all born with. And it starts in a different place for each individual. But if you have a tipping point that's positioned over here in terms of your basic biology, that means it's going to essentially preference the weight on the negative side. If you have a tipping point that's positioned at this end of the scale, it's going to preference the amount of weight that's on the positive side of the scale. And what we want to have happen for a resilient outcome is we want that scale to tip in the positive direction, regardless of whether or not there is negative weight on that opposite arm. Now, it turns out, here's where some of the real neuroscience comes into it. This tipping point, our basic biology, is actually sensitive to the experiences that we have in childhood as well as across the lifespan, but most exquisitely in childhood. And so that means that we can actually shift this tipping point in key ways, provided we're giving children as well as adults the right kinds of supports, the right kinds of experiences to influence our biology in key ways and make that positive outcome more likely to happen over time. And so what I want to do for you now is think about these three sort of aspects of resilience and unpack them for you a little bit more. And so the first one I want to talk about is that positive arm. So how is it that the brain develops, and how does that development typically go well? What makes it go well? Oops. So the first thing to remember is that brain development is actually quite a long-term process. It starts just after conception, and it lasts well into what we used to think of as the adult period. Turns out that our brains don't finish maturing until we're in our mid to our late 20s. And you can think about the process that the brain uses to guide that development as being very similar to the process that you would use to build a house. So when you're first thinking about building that house, well, first you have to have a basic blueprint, right? That's going to tell you the relative size of the house, how many levels there are, how many rooms there are, and where they all are in relationship to one another. But it's not really going to tell you what the house is going to look like at the end of the day. That's going to depend on the finishes that you put into the house and the furnishings and that type of thing. Well, the brain also has a basic blueprint that guides the developmental process, and that's really our genes. But it turns out we've mapped the human genome. We have roughly 23,000 genes in that genome. And that's not enough genes to code specifically for all of the connections between all of the cells in the brain. So what genes really do is provide a basic blueprint, but they don't actually dictate what that structure is going to look like at the end of the day. And the same way where, when you're first starting to build that house, you're going to dig a hole and lay a strong foundation, because that has to support all of the visible structure that you're going to build on top, the second story and the roof and that type of thing. You guys know that if you get a fault in your foundation, you could potentially put a crack in your roof over time. Well, in the same way, during development, the brain is busy laying down, hopefully, a strong foundation of fairly basic neural circuits that are going to support the development of more complex circuits that emerge over time. You get a fault anywhere in one of those earlier developmental circuits, you can potentially destabilize some of that later neural circuitry, which is developing sometimes several years into the future. And just like, again, where the kind of finishes that you use in that house, whether it's the high-end marble countertops or the hardwood floors, are going to dictate the quality of that structure. In the same way, the quality of the experiences that we have during development also dictate the quality of the structure of that brain that's going to be built over time. So high quality experiences equals high quality structure, low quality experiences equals low quality structure. So keep that concept in mind as we go through this presentation, because it applies throughout that quite long period of roughly 25 years of brain development. Now, again, when neural circuits first start wiring up, what happens is there is a genetic signal that gets sent out that tells the cells, okay, now is the time to start reaching out and making connections with all of the other cells around you. So when neural circuits first start to develop and mature, what you see is a steep uptick in connectivity between the cells in that particular area. And what this graph shows you is essentially a depiction of that with three sort of representative sets of neural circuits. What you see on the vertical axis here is the number of connections that are forming between the cells. And what you see down along the bottom is age, the prenatal period, first year of life, and age out to 19 in the last third of the graph. And the takeaway here is that each one of these neural circuits is essentially supporting the development of the next most complex neural circuit in this diagram. So the first set of circuits that are wiring up here, represented by that orange line, there are sensory systems, pretty basic neural circuits in comparison to some other circuits in the brain. And it's important to have those online just around the time of birth. So what you're seeing is this sort of steep uptick in connectivity in the perinatal period. These are the circuits that allow us to take in information about the world around us so that we can eventually learn to react to it in some way and, interact with our environment. So it's really important to have them online just at birth. But the takeaway is that these particular systems are supporting the development of the next most complex neural circuit in this graph, which is represented by the blue line here, our language circuits. So language circuits are wiring up over the first year of life, and they're heavily dependent on auditory inputs. We know that if little babies can't hear spoken language, they're not going to be able to learn how to speak because they don't have that input to help shape and sculpt those language circuits at this very sensitive period of development. So if you potentially have a problem with auditory pathways, you can potentially produce a problem in language pathways. And the last set of circuits that are wiring up in this particular graph are represented here by the red line. They're called higher cognitive functions here. These are things like being able to pay attention, follow lots of rules, get along with our peers. And the takeaway here is that not only are they dependent on our sensory pathways, so our ability to take in information about the world around us that we can learn to react to it in some way, but we're also a social species. They're also dependent on our ability to communicate with other people. So you get some kind of problem in some of our sensory pathways or in some of our communicative pathways, you can potentially derail some of these higher cognitive functions if we can't get in there and intervene in ways to keep them on their best developmental track. Now, what you'll also notice in this graph is a steep drop-off in connectivity, which is occurring over time. It turns out that when it comes to the developing brain, more connections between cells are not necessarily better. What's happening here is a normal developmental process called pruning. And it's the way in which the brain removes connections from neural circuits to create speed and efficiency in processing information. And the reason why the pruning is such an important mechanism that guides brain development is because it really is experience dependent. It happens in a use it or lose it kind of fashion. And what that means is that the connections in neural circuits that get used the most are the connections that are going to get nice and strong and stable and remain over the lifespan of that circuit. The connections that don't get used very much, the brain figures are not really useful for that circuit because they're not being used. They'll get weaker and weaker and eventually get pruned away over time. Because keep in mind, when those circuits start wiring up, there is no specific plan for that wire up. There's a genetic signal that says when, but then the cells actually explode and create a number of connections, which some of which might be a little bit haphazard and not useful to the circuit as a whole. And it's that experience-based pruning process which weeds through all of those connections, determine which are good and which are not, and which can be pruned away. And this next graph just shows you what this looks like in the human brain. So this is a very thin slice through the human brain at 3 ages, birth, 3 years, and 14 years. And all of these blobby bits in each one of these brain sections represent the bodies of cells in the brain. And all of those long lines coming off of them are called axons and dendrites. They're the places where the cells make the most connections with other cells around them. So you can infer the more long lines, the more connections between the cells. And as you can see in this particular area at birth, that circuit's not wired up. There are very few connections between the cells. By 3 years of age, there's been a huge explosion of connectivity. But by 14 years of age, probably between 50 and 60% of those connections are now gone. But this is the more mature configuration of the circuit. We're going to be faster and better at doing whatever this circuit actually supports at 14 years of age than we are at 3 years of age, even though we have fewer connections. It's because we're going to be faster and more efficient at doing whatever this circuit does. Now, I've said the word experience a number of times. What kind of experiences are the most important to have, particularly during development? Well, it turns out that there's only one kind of experience that we know of, that if it's absent in the developmental period, you can see deficits across multiple functional domains. And those experiences are actually social interactions. So I want you to think a bit broadly about social interactions here. We often think of them as being kind of like a serve and return between a child and a responsive adult. And what they look like is the child serves up some sort of bid for communication. We as the responsive adult need to recognize that they're serving, return that in a developmentally appropriate way, and ideally in a way that keeps that interaction going back and forth for a particular period of time. The goal of these serve and return style interactions is really to build key neural circuits in the brain through practice, practice, practice. So what they do is they ramp up the child's enthusiasm for doing whatever it is that they're doing, get them to do it more and more often. And this is literally building whatever key neural circuit that interaction is exercising in that child's brain. So they're really critical in building basic cognitive, social, and emotional skills, what we often think of as pro-social skills that will set us up well and provide some of that foundation for resilience as we move forward throughout life. But I do want to say, even though these serve and return style social interactions are critical during development because they're literally building sensitive neural circuits, they're also critical to us across the lifespan. So if you think about this sort of serve and return style interaction, it really is the basis of talk therapy. What happens when we're experiencing difficulties and we go in and we get some kind of clinical intervention? Well, we typically have a supportive adult who can give us perspective, who can give us some exercises that can help us build skills and abilities throughout our lives through that practice sort of situation. And so it's really should be no surprise to find out that many studies have now shown that the strength of the therapeutic alliance is one of the best predictors of good outcomes for talk therapy. So it's critical, not just in childhood, but also in adulthood. So what I want to do now is just give you maybe a minute or two to reflect. I know that many people in this webinar are professionals who have a key interest in this field. So whether you actually work with clients on a regular basis, or whether you're a policymaker, or even if you're just an interested citizen, take a minute to think about, how does what you do help load up that positive arm for kids, for families, for individuals? And if you don't work in the field, think about yourself. What sort of positive experiences and supportive relationships do you access to help build your own resilience? And if you have any examples of that, feel free to put it into the Q&A because there might be some great examples of that at the end of the presentation. Okay, so moving on, what I want to do now is talk a little bit more about the tipping point on this resilience scale. So this is really about our basic biology and how those experiences are going to be shaping that biology in key ways, and how they shape some really critical skills and abilities that support resilience over time. So the first concept I want to talk about is something called epigenetics. So many of you might have heard of epigenetics. It is the way in which the cells in our bodies control gene expression. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, remember I told you we have roughly 23,000 genes in the human genome. And if you recall back to the last time you took a biology class, hopefully you'll remember that every cell in our bodies has a copy, technically two, but still a copy of every single one of those 23,000 genes. But not all of the cells in our bodies look the same, right? We have brain cells, we have blood cells, we have bone cells, skin cells, heart cells, hair cells. And it turns out that they all look different, and they're able to perform different functions because they have different subsets of those 23,000 genes turned on or expressed. Now, what happens to the genes that don't get turned on or aren't expressed? Well, they're not cut away. The cell doesn't just get rid of them. What happens is something that we often refer to as gene silencing. And so what can happen is a molecule can come along, literally sit on top of a particular gene and block it from the cellular machinery that turns it on. And so this is really what epigenetics is all about. It's just about controlling gene expression over time. And we've known about this particular phenomenon for decades, but up until the 90s, people thought that epigenetic control of gene expression was essentially complete by the time we were born, because it was really just about helping our bodies, create different cell lines that support different functions. But some work from McGill University in the early 90s actually showed that postnatal experiences and environments also influence gene expression in key ways. And the seminal paper on this was from Michael Meany in his lab. They had a really interesting natural experiment and a serendipitous finding, and many scientific breakthroughs follow this pattern. They were looking at different environments, different rearing environments in rodents, to see whether or not this would have some sort of impact on behavior, cognition later on in life. And somebody noticed in their breeding colony of rats that they had two naturally occurring different types of rat mothers, for lack of a better word, and the type of care that they provided occurring in the colony. They had a group of mums who they ended up calling the super mums, who spent an awful lot of time interacting with their pups. And so how does a rat mother show her love? Well, she licks and grooms the pups a lot, and she retrieves them when they come out of the nest, and she spends a lot of time snuggling them up against her belly. And then they had another group of rat mums on the other end of the spectrum, who were not neglectful, but spent measurably less time interacting with their pups. So didn't lick and groom as often, didn't retrieve them if they scurried out of the nest, didn't spend as much time snuggling them up against their belly. And they had a whole bunch of mums in between who they didn't look at. So they took the two extreme ends of this spectrum, again, natural experiment, and allowed those rat pups to age up into adulthood and tested them on a number of mazes. And to their surprise, what they found is that the rat pups who had grown up, the rats who had grown up as pups in the sort of lower quality care condition with the mums who were less attentive, actually showed much greater reactions to challenging and threatening situations. And they measured this by looking at the level of a stress hormone called cortisol in the bloodstream of the rats. And thankfully, one of the colleagues down the hall happened to be a geneticist, who said, why don't we look at the pattern of gene expression to see if that had anything to do with it? And sure enough, what they found was one of these little chemical markers sitting right on top of a critical gene involved in the stress response system. So what happened was this little chemical marker ended up reducing gene expression in the brain for a key gene called the glucocorticoid receptor gene. It's the receptor for cortisol in the brain. That's the physiological response. But functionally, what happened was the rats from the low quality care condition ended up being sensitized to stressful situations. Their stress response systems were suddenly hyperactive because of this genetic change. Now, it turns out, if you think about this from an evolutionary perspective, people do think that this is the way in which our biology helps to set us up to do well in the environments that we're born in. So if you think about the rat as a species, it's a social species, lives in groups, shares responsibility for finding food and keeping watch out for, danger, owls, that sort of thing. And if you're getting a signal early in development that you don't actually have a lot of social support, it might actually be adaptive for you to become a little bit more vigilant in your environment, a little bit more reactive to some of the perceived threats that might be out there, because you don't have anyone else watching your back. And it turns out these particular types of changes, genetic changes, have been identified across a number of mammalian species, including humans. All social species, they have a lack of support during critical developmental periods, can show sensitization of their stress response system. Now, it turns out that once these genetic changes occur, they tend to be permanent. That means that they don't tend to revert back once we're in adulthood. And what we now think is that this is potentially the biological basis for intergenerational trauma, one of those key biological bases. So you have an environment where you have very low social support, produces some key genetic changes. which then stay with you over the course of your life and set you up to potentially not be able to provide the key social support that you might have otherwise been able to have when you have your own children. And these genetic changes are also potentially heritable. We also know they can potentially be inherited out to at least one generation in humans, out to at least three generations in rodents. So again, these types of changes can potentially be perpetuated across the generations through a genetic mechanism. Now, the next thing I want to do is come back to this idea of pruning and revisit it again, because pruning is another key way that shapes neural circuits in the brain and affects our biology. So we've already gone through this slide once before, but now I want to give you an example of how this might look in a developing child. So imagine a child growing up in a stable two-parent family with access to high-quality childcare, safe playground down the street where they can go and get lots of physical activity, lots of interaction with their peers on a regular basis. When the child gets into the school system, the teachers are very attentive and able to spend a lot of one-on-one time with each child. The kind of environment that this child is growing up in is helping them exercise essentially a number of pro-social skills and abilities, which are then sculpting key pro-social neural circuits in the brain. So what is this child likely getting lots of opportunity to practice? Well, they're likely getting lots of opportunity to practice those strong, trusting, attachment-based relationships around them or with adults around them. They are likely getting lots of opportunity to practice early language and literacy. They're getting likely lots of opportunity to practice learning to get along with their peers and strengthening those social skills so that they can form lasting relationships. They're likely getting a lot of opportunity to practice emotional control, because when they're upset, they have a lot of adult support to help teach them how to calm themselves down. So this child in that particular environment is likely going to get a pretty strong foundation of really basic pro-social skills that's going to stand them in good stead as they continue to grow and mature and eventually move on into adulthood and face some of the, stresses and strains that we all face in everyday life. Now imagine a child growing up in a different type of environment. So perhaps there is domestic violence in the home, substance misuse on the part of both parents, no access to quality childcare. The parents do try and get the lady down the hall to look after their kid when they're out, but if she's not available, they might leave their child home alone for long periods of time. There aren't a lot of other kids in the neighborhood for the child to get together with, and that playground down the street, well, you know what? It's full of gang activity and drug dealing, so it's not a safe place for kids to go anyway. And when the child finally gets to school, well, the teachers are all busy and they're not able to spend a lot of one-on-one time with each child in their class. So this child is having a very different set of experiences, which is essentially driving that pruning process in a very different way. What kind of skills and abilities does this child get the opportunity to practice? Well, they're likely practicing a lot of skills and activities and behaviors around anger and aggression, because this is what they're seeing in their home. Recall, there's domestic violence. They are likely practicing a lot of fear-based behaviors, because it can be a pretty scary situation when mommy and daddy are drunk and fighting. And the flip side is, what are the other skills that the child doesn't get the same opportunity to practice? Well, it's quite likely that this child doesn't get the same opportunity to practice early language and literacy because the adults around them are preoccupied with their own issues and not thinking about reading to that child or encouraging that child to speak on a regular basis. They are likely not getting the same opportunity to practice good emotional control because they don't have any adults around them when they're upset to help teach them how to control their emotions and calm themselves down. They're also likely not getting the same opportunity to practice learning how to get along with their peers, because there's not a lot of other kids in the neighborhood and not a lot of opportunities to get together and play with kids their own age. So in these two very different examples, those early environments can essentially set us up potentially on life course trajectories with a very solid foundation that will hopefully stand us in good stead, barring any other major events, or potentially with a shaky foundation that is likely not going to set that child up very well unless some additional intervention can be brought in at a later date. So these environments not only shape gene expression, but they also shape that pruning process over time. Now, what are some of the most important skills and abilities that we want to develop and have nice and strong and foundational to support us in our resilience across the lifespan? Well, some of the most important skills and abilities are lumped together in one word called executive function. But executive function isn't just one thing, it's a whole suite of abilities that work together. They work in tandem to help us navigate through complex physical, social, and emotional environments. So we often think about them as being kind of like an air traffic control system in the brain. So if you think about what goes on in a busy airport, you've got all of those planes trying to take off and land all at the same time. What do the controllers up in the tower have to do? Well, they have to be able to pay attention to large banks of radar screens and make sure none of those blips are getting too close together, right? They have to be able to remember and follow lots of different rules, different protocols for different weather conditions. So if it's rainy and foggy, you might have one protocol for how you allow planes to take off and land. Or, I'm speaking to you from Calgary, Alberta. Here, it's much more likely to be gusty winds at 120 kilometers an hour. Well, maybe you have to close one of the runways depending on where the wind is coming from. So you have to be able to remember and follow all of those rules. You have to be able to shift on the fly when the information changes. A new blip just shows up on the screen. Oh my gosh, this is a flight coming in from Montreal that nobody told us about. And now maybe you have to rejig everybody's landing patterns that new flight can land before it runs out of fuel. And you have to be able to do all of this while understanding what's going on for you emotionally, controlling it, and ensuring that it's appropriate for the situation at hand. That's really that self-regulation piece. So executive function skills are critically important for us. And it turns out when they're working well, they're pretty much invisible. We don't really notice them at all. It's when they're not working well that we can sometimes see some difficulties. These types of skills, we all have a different continuum of capacity on them. But people who don't have the best working memory might be people who really struggle with following rules. For little kids, it might be a little kid who just can't remember, more than 3 or 4 steps before they start wandering around going, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Or for adults, people who really struggle to, for example, follow a treatment plan in healthcare, take their medications on a regular basis. They might just actually not be able to follow some of those rules very well. So these types of skills are important for us across the lifespan because they really predict 3 key things. First, they predict academic success. And this isn't, going to, getting post-secondary education, that type of thing. What I mean here is really whether or not you graduate from high school versus dropping out or flunking out. And it turns out that some of the most critical skills involved in getting your high school diploma are what the original research called soft skills. So your ability to show up and be a bum in a seat on a regular basis. Okay, this is really about delayed gratification and impulse control. Do you prefer to cut class to go to the skateboard park, or will you actually think, okay, well, no, maybe I should actually show up for school and go to the skateboard park later? The ability to respond to feedback, cognitive flexibility. When you get feedback from your teacher on a particular assignment, are you able to incorporate that feedback and do better the next time? It's really cognitive flexibility. Again, your ability to complete your assignments on time and as asked, that to a certain extent is working memory or following instructions. And again, delayed gratification, completing stuff on time versus doing something else. And your ability to get along with the other students and the teacher that you have. And that's really a lot about that self-regulation piece, right? So executive function skills are critically important for academic success, which of course then predicts employment success. And employment success is the other key outcome that I want to talk about now. What do employers want from their employees? Well, they want people to be showing up for work on time on a regular basis. They want you to complete your assignments on time and as asked. They want you to get along with your colleagues, with your boss. And they might even want you to be able to be a creative problem solver. Well, those are all executive function skills. And the last outcome that I'll mention here is successful parenting of the next generation. So I'm sure that many people who are on this webinar today are parents themselves. Think about what it takes to be a successful or at least moderately successful, maybe we'll say, parent. Well, you have to be able to remember and follow lots of routines. You have to be able to put your child's needs in front of your own. You have to be able to shift on the fly when the information changes. The information's always changing, right? And then you have to be able to control your own emotions when your child's having a problem controlling theirs. And all of those are executive function skills. So they're incredibly important to us and predict a lot of what we might think of as key outcomes that would define a fairly successful citizen in society. And it turns out that executive function is located in a key area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. That's the area here behind the forehead and the eyes. And it turns out that the prefrontal cortex is the very last area of the brain to fully mature. What I have for you here is a composite MRI map of the developing cortex of the brain from age 5 down through age 20. This is the back of the head, and this is the nose here. It's a right-hand view. This is a top view. That means this is the nose, and this is the back of the head. And all of those pinky red areas are the least developed areas of the cortex. The blue areas are the most developed areas. And what you're seeing over time is this gradual back to front maturational process that's going on here. And that means that given that this is the last area of the cortex to fully mature, it's the area that remains exquisitely sensitive to experiences throughout about 2.5 decades worth of development. That means there's a really long window in which we have to potentially get in there and shore up that skill set by providing opportunities to practice those skills over time. So I want to just take another minute here and ask you to reflect a little bit, whether you're a professional who works with clients in the field, whether you're a policymaker, or whether you're simply an interested citizen taking part and can think about yourself, how does what you do help to build some of those pro-social skills and coping abilities in either the children, families, or adults that you work with? Okay, and I'm going to move on because, as always, we always run a little bit behind here. So the last area of this resilience concept that I want to talk about now are the negative experiences. These things here that weigh down this negative arm and make that scale tip in the positive direction. And so this is really stress. Now, it turns out that not all stress is the same, but stress also shapes the developing brain in key ways that can either set us up to cope with it well or set us up to potentially struggle with it. So we often think about stress as falling into 3 main categories in development. The first is called positive stress. It's a brief activation of the stress response system. It's essentially required for healthy development because it gives kids the opportunity to practice their stress coping skills in the context of a developmentally appropriate challenge. So the kinds of things that we often think about as causing positive stress are things like maybe meeting new people, the first day of school, or even falling off your bike and scraping a knee. For most kids, these are developmentally appropriate challenges that they're able to cope with, and we want them to have those on a regular basis to strengthen those coping skills over time. The next kind of stress is called tolerable stress. So this is a more serious, albeit usually temporary, activation of the stress response system. But the key here is that the child has access to a caring, supportive adult who essentially can help buffer their response to that stress. The adult acts as essentially an external stress response system for the child. So in the absence of adult support, those stress hormones are going to get released, they're going to go high, and they're going to stay high for a fairly long period of time. But with adult support, the adult's able to calm that child down much, much faster than they could have done on their own, soothe their fears, maybe help coach them in their stress coping strategies, or teach them more complex strategies if they're ready for that at that particular period of time. So in that way, because tolerable stress is buffered, it doesn't leave a lasting impact on our biology. But the last kind of stress is the bad guy when we think about its effect on the developing brain, and that's why it's called toxic stress. So this is a prolonged activation of the stress response system, and the key here is it's in the absence of adequate adult support. So what that means is stress hormones are released, they go high, and they stay high for long periods of time. And it's those high levels of stress hormones over a long period of time that do get biologically embedded in key ways into the developing brain and help take that development off of its best track. So the best studied types of toxic stress are really things like child maltreatment, neglect, different types of family dysfunction, but those are not the only types of things that might cause toxic stress. In childhood, if we think about things like bullying and systemic racism, or unstable housing, being homeless, very low SES, some of these things can also cause toxic stress if they're not appropriately buffered. So how do those stress hormones get under our skins? Well, there's essentially three main ways. But first, it's important to understand how the stress response system works. I have a diagram for you here of the human stress response system. But what's important to note is that the stress response system is evolutionarily conserved. That means that every mammal has a stress response system that looks pretty much exactly the same as this one. And it was designed and evolved over millennia to help us deal with essentially short-term threats. So when we perceive a threat in the environment, little nucleus here in the midbrain sends out a signal, which will end up dumping stress hormones into our bodies. And those stress hormones essentially prepare us for fight or flight. But those hormones, particularly one called cortisol, also have another key function, and that is to cross back into the brain when the threat is gone, interact through a receptor, and shut off hormone production. And so what happens when this stress response system is active for long periods of time? Well, those stress hormones, as they course through our bodies and interact with our cardiovascular system, our metabolic system, our immune system, they essentially jack those systems up, and then they come back to baseline. They get jacked up and come back to baseline numerous times, and those systems are not designed to work that way. It essentially produces some wear and tear on those cells, and that typically doesn't get repaired. So what'll happen is over time, damage can accumulate, making us vulnerable to disorders of the cardiovascular system, the metabolic system, the immune system, sometimes decades into the future. Now, the next two ways that these stress hormones get biologically embedded during development, at least, happen through the impact of cortisol on the brain itself. So there are a number of different receptive fields for cortisol in the brain, and one of them is here in the prefrontal cortex, the seat, if you recall, of our executive functions. And what cortisol is doing when we're under threat is essentially dampening down our ability to use those executive functions so that we can revert to a more reactive behavioral repertoire. You know, if there was literally a bear coming through the door right now, it wouldn't work for me or be useful for me to overthink that. No, I mean, I want to be reacting very, very quickly. And so when we're under a great amount of threat, that's essentially what cortisol is doing for us. It's dampening down those executive functions. And if you think about a time in your life, in your adult life, by the way, when you were under an awful lot of stress for a long time, did you ever find that maybe you got a little bit irritable more often than you might have before? Maybe got a little bit absent-minded, maybe weren't quite as good at problem solving? Well, that's the long-term effect of cortisol on your executive functions. Now, if those functions are well developed and very well laid down, when that stress is gone, your functions are going to return to normal. But when we're experiencing toxic stress as children, what's happening is cortisol is preventing us from essentially exercising that neural circuit because, again, it's not yet fully developed and we need to use it in order to ensure we're able to hone and build those skills over time. And if we're prevented from doing that, we can essentially blunt our ability to have really good executive functioning skills. So in that way, that toxic stress during childhood can actually end up meaning that our executive functions are not going to be very stable and strong over the course of our lifespan. And the last way that stress gets under our skins is through its interaction with the stress response system itself. Again, keep in mind, cortisol acts through a receptor to shut down essentially stress hormone production. But those cells are kind of like our peripheral cells, not designed to be constantly bombarded with cortisol. That makes them fire so that they'll, send a signal down through the circuit to essentially shut off hormone production. And when that happens, more and more often, and those cells are active all of the time, it's not really wear and tear that happens because keep in mind, brain cells are plastic and they can change in response to their experience. What they do is they start removing their connections from other cells in the circuit. It's essentially a survival mechanism for these cells. They don't have to fire as often. But what happens is the circuit becomes less and less efficient at shutting down hormone production because the signal becomes weaker and weaker as more of those connections get removed. And so what you can end up with is a bit of a vicious cycle. The more cortisol you have bombarding this circuit over long periods of time, the less efficient you'll be at shutting down cortisol production, and the more cortisol you'll eventually have circulating back, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the three main ways that stress really gets under our skins. So now I want to talk just a little bit about some of those short and long-term outcomes associated with early adversity before revisiting this concept of resilience again and bringing it home. So it turns out that adversity very early in life can produce a pretty profound effect across a number of functional domains. This is data from a study of just over 1,000 children in the child protection system. All of these children had a substantiated claim of child abuse in their file. And what the researchers did was at 3 years of age, they tested these kids on a standard 5-domain developmental task. And then they looked at the number of kids who were failing in at least one developmental domain. And they graph that against the number of types of toxic stress or adversity that these kids had experienced prior to 3 years of age. So this isn't a frequency count, by the way. This is not a child was physically abused 5 times or 6 times. This is the number of types of adversity. So whether the child had been physically abused, emotionally abused, whether or not there was domestic violence in the home, et cetera, et cetera. And as you can see, as the number of types of adversity goes up, the likelihood that these kids are going to show developmental delays at 3 years of age goes up as well, such that by the time we get to about 6 or 7 types of adversity, almost 100% of these kids are showing developmental delays. And these could be delays in the physical domain, the social domain, communication domain, language, etc. And I think the really key takeaway here is just to recall that these children were assessed developmentally at 3 years of age, which meant that whatever happened to them happened before they were 3. And that meant that likely at least some of these kids would not be able to remember what happened to them. And the takeaway is really that, we don't have to remember what happens to us in order for that event to have an impact on our biology. A 6-month to 1-year-old baby has a stress response system just like a 6 to 7-year-old child does, or a 60 to 70-year-old adult does. And when that stress response system is active for long enough, it's going to impair some of our skills and abilities through the 3 ways that I just talked about, in terms of either being biologically embedded in neural circuits or potentially creating some wear and tear in our peripheral systems that might show up many years in the future. And now thinking about a few adult outcomes and key adult outcomes, I think, for the discussion that we have today. This is some data from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which is the largest study of its kind that it has been done to date. It's a study of over 17,000 middle class, middle-aged, highly educated, employed adults in California. A partnership between the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta and a big HMO called Kaiser Permanente. And what they did was they asked these adults, when they were coming in for their periodic health exam, a series of 10 questions. Before the age of 18, did you ever experience? And it was 5 different types of child maltreatment and 5 different types of family dysfunction. So did you experience physical neglect, emotional neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, or emotional abuse? Did you witness domestic violence? Was anyone in your household a substance misuser? Did anyone have an untreated mental illness? Was anyone in your family ever incarcerated? And did you ever lose a parent for any reason, including divorce? And if you answered a yes, you would score a 1. And if you answered a no, you would score a 0. And they just added up that score out of 10 and called it the Adverse Childhood Experiences Score, ACE score. And so the next few slides are all from the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. So what you can see is ACE score is here along the bottom. The risk of developing a major depressive disorder in adulthood is along the side. And as you can see, as the number of ACEs we experience in childhood goes up, the risk of developing depression goes up as well, such that by the time you have 5 or more ACEs, you are 5 times more likely to develop a depressive disorder in adulthood compared to somebody with an ACE score of 0. Now, we know there are many pathways to developing depression. We know that there are certain genes that make us vulnerable, and that depression can and does run in families. But there are other pathways that can lead to depression as well. And one of them is the presence of early adversity, because it can sensitize our stress response system, reduce our coping capacities through their impact on our prefrontal cortex and executive functioning. And what are some of the key predictors of whether or not something will make you depressed? Well, it's a proximal stressor. Something bad just happened to you. And quite often a lack of social support and a lack of problem solving support, right? So these are other ways that depression can occur through early adversity. So this is the risk of substance misuse disorders in adulthood. What you can see on the left hand is a self-report of alcoholism. On the right hand is self-report of illicit drug use. And what you see is ACE scores along the bottom. You again see this dose-response relationship. As the number of adverse childhood experiences increases, the risk of developing substance misuse increases as well. Unfortunately, I don't have a slide just with injection drug use. But if you consider just injection drug use, what you would see is once you get to about 5 or more, this bar is pretty much off the charts. And again, there are many pathways that bring people to substance misuse. We do know that there are certain genes that can make particular people quite vulnerable to substance misuse. We know that if parents have a substance misuse problem, a child can learn that this is sort of a good coping strategy and emulate that as they continue to grow into adulthood. But we also know that there's another pathway as well, a pathway involving adverse childhood experiences. And again, it's about that executive function system, which is not well developed, not nice and strong and stable. We know that addiction involves, in particular, deficits in prefrontal control or top-down executive control. We know that the stress response system of people who experience adversity in childhood can be sensitized in the long term. What do these substances do? Well, they actually decrease stress, right? They decrease stress and boost our mood. Amphetamine was first used back in the 1930s as an antidepressant. Go figure. So these are potentially some short-term solutions to problems that were really, really founded by the presence of toxic stress early in development. Of course, long-term use produces additional problems and can lead to quite chronic addiction in some people. So again, many pathways to addiction, but adverse childhood experiences is definitely one of them. And it turns out, even though we've talked a lot about adverse childhood experiences, adult toxic stress also affects brain and behavior. So if you've experienced toxic stress, whether it's in childhood or adulthood, but quite often people who experience toxic stress in childhood tend to experience more toxic stress in adulthood. What we can see over multiple studies, which have shown increase in risk for addiction, mental illness, suicide, risky sexual behaviors, many different types of chronic diseases, including cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, including obesity, immune disorders, including autoimmune, chronic pain, and even memory loss and dementia as we age. There's an increased risk for domestic violence and divorce, having unstable or no employment, homelessness, and criminal behavior. All of these things, while not entirely attributed to toxic stress, definitely are more common in people who've experienced toxic stress both in children and adults. So now I want to wrap up here, but wanted to just have you guys start thinking a little bit about this negative arm. What do you do in terms of your professional life or thinking about yourself to sort of buffer the effects of toxic stress in the people who you work with, in yourself, or in your close friends or family members? How do you mitigate or buffer some of that? Because I think it's important to continue to think about what this actually means when we're talking about day-to-day practice. But now I just want to wrap up and bring this back again to resilience. That was a lot of bad news, but I do want to say that it turns out that most people who experience adversity in childhood end up with fairly good outcomes across the lifespan. So it is not a guarantee. It is merely a risk factor. And what we have to continue to remember is that those positive experiences and supportive relationships continue to build resilience, both in children and in adults across the lifespan. And so it's again that relationship aspect that will scaffold those coping skills, buffer the impacts of stress when we're experiencing it, which are really, really critical to, again, continuing to build that resilience over time. And it turns out it's never too late to build resilience. So even though, yes, it's easier, faster, and cheaper to get it right the first time. The blue line here is the brain's ability to change in response to experiences. It's highest in early childhood. But guess what? It never goes to zero. What happens, though, is that the amount of time, the amount of resources, the amount of effort we need to put in to creating change does go up the older we get. But it is possible to teach an old dog new tricks. And so I want to just end it there for people and turn it back over to whoever is speaking next. And I think that's Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sherren, for your fantastic presentation. We have so many questions that have rolled through. So I'll quickly introduce myself and we'll get right to those. My name is Jennifer Lloyd and I'm the manager of mental health and well-being at Georgian College. And I have the great privilege of co-chairing the prevention pillar of the Simcoe-Muskoka opioid strategy with Claudia, who welcomed us earlier. So we do have a number of questions, and if Dr. Sherren is up for it, we will get right to it.
Yes, absolutely.
Wonderful. We're hoping the first question that we see, which is not a surprise, is related to physical distancing and COVID. We had a number of questions, so I'm sort of grouping these, but basically folks are wondering, what are your thoughts about the impacts of really the past year, physical and social distancing on resilience and really those positive social experiences?
Well, you know, this is a pretty unusual situation because, you know, we all have essentially our resilience scale, and all of us have just had a massive red block placed on that negative arm, right? And I do think that some people with a fairly strong foundation and with currently good supports are going to be able to manage reasonably well through the pandemic. There have been a lot of silver linings that I've heard of around bringing families closer together. I even think about my own family. I currently live in Alberta. I have no family here. And I'd never heard of Zoom before the pandemic. Well, now I'm able to Zoom with all my relatives in Ontario and the Maritimes. I never would have done that before if there wasn't a pandemic. So that has been a bit of a positive. However, when we think about kids and families, it hasn't just been the physical distancing for some of them. There have been real financial impacts, which are causing a lot of stress for families right now, loss of employment, kids not being able to socialize as much in schools. So they've lost some of their peer connections. And I think it's an opportunity for all of us to think about, as a community, how do we come together to support the broader health of our community? You know, not just as a colleague of, you know, somebody who works in this area, but let's say as a neighbor. When I think about myself, you know, how do I support my neighbors over time? Because the pandemic, I think, is lasting way longer than anyone thought it would as well. And so the first few months, it's kind of like, oh, it'll all be okay. Maybe, you know, after the summer and into the fall. And then we really went into another kind of year of that. So I think it's important for everyone to think about their own mental health, their own resilience, finding that time to fill their own cup, because you can't fill anyone else's, of course, the old adage, right? If yours is not full as well. And then seeking support and help wherever you can find it. You know, again, I discovered that, hey, there was a Zoom access for me that I'd never known about before, right? So that was a bit of a lifeline there to stay connected with extended family and with other friends who I have as well, even though, of course, it has to be through a video chat. But I think video is better than nothing at all. And so whenever you have that ability to do that, take advantage of that. And then think again about how you can support some community health as well, because I think there are a lot of people in community who might not have those supports. And it's up to us to be thinking about them as well.
Thank you. That was beautifully put. The next question that is, this is again kind of a theme, but essentially there's this notion of, I'll say this very respectfully, but helicopter parenting. So that's the quickest way that I can describe what's being asked. But essentially, our participants are wondering, do you have any cautions or thoughts on the concerns that are related to this overprotection of our children, almost the opposite of toxic stress, some of the adverse childhood experiences. Can you speak a little bit about that paradox?
Sure. Absolutely, there has been a lot of research now coming out on this sort of overprotection, bubble wrapping, helicopter parenting, which does indicate that that is not, generally speaking, beneficial for child development. And it's because it actually prevents kids from experiencing those developmentally appropriate challenges that give them the opportunity to practice coping with stress. And so when we think about, I don't want to say anything, super specific about this, but, when we think about now when kids join sports teams, there's no winners or losers, everyone gets a trophy. It's not meant to be about a loser. It's just meant to be about, there is a score to this game, and, we didn't get the highest score. So next time we're going to try a little bit harder. And so I think that not giving children the ability to get that practice is in many ways detrimental, potentially not as detrimental maybe as adverse childhood experiences or toxic stress, but detrimental in terms of potentially giving them a bit of a shaky foundation, which many people have reported. And so while we don't have to let our kids run wild, and while we don't have to, not, be around for them, it's important to be around for them. But I think it is important to also give them the space to challenge themselves, not just to use their skills and abilities, but to challenge them from time to time. And it's okay to actually not do well, because they're going to then learn to try again. It's about being supportive in that moment and helping them think about what they need to do to continue to grow and build. So I think it's a great question. And it's something that I know that for some kids has become potentially a bit of a problem, but fantastic.
That's excellent. There's actually another question that is a bit different. So if social circumstances change and an individual ends up having lots of social support in mid to late adulthood that perhaps they didn't experience in childhood or adolescence, adulthood, will their vigilance and extreme sensitivity to those minor stressors be able to improve?
Yes, it can. So one of the things that can happen for people who have been sort of sensitized to these low supportive environments, and that means their stress response system is sort of active. One of the challenges is that it can impair our ability to form those strong supportive relationships later on in life. But if we can bring those into play, it can absolutely over time start to shift how we react to our environment around us, and some of that neural circuitry. And again, I come back to this idea of this is really the cornerstone of talk therapy. And what is talk therapy really? It's a therapeutic alliance. It's a strong, supportive social relationship, right? And so we often see in terms of people who have maybe high ACE scores, but good outcomes. What the resilience literature has shown is that the single common denominator across all of those studies is the presence of at least one supportive relationship, right? So if you have somebody who's able to find, let's say, a spouse who's highly supportive, that type of thing, that can potentially make a really big difference. And yes, it can start to shift some of our biology in key ways, teach us new skills. Of course, it takes longer and more effort to do that. We might not see quite as much shift as if we'd done it in childhood, but it can absolutely make a critical difference. One of the main predictors of early mortality in the elderly is absence of relationship, right? And of course, the longer we live, our spouse dies, our friends die, or that type of thing, and it can leave people very, 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 very feeling very lonely and unsupported. So those are critical across the lifespan for our mental health, but I absolutely do think they can help to shift skills and abilities as well.
Thank you so much. Another participant is actually asking you to speak a little bit, if you can, about the role that that socioeconomic status or social determinants of health really play in this.
So this is a sort of a more complex area, because poverty in and of itself does not necessarily produce toxic stress for, let's say, a child. However, what do we know? When a family has low SES, it generally speaking causes more stress for the parents. When the parents are stressed, they're potentially not in quite as good of a position to provide support for their child. And the reason why I want to be careful about this is because just because you're poor does not mean you don't love your child. Just because you're poor does not mean you don't want the best for your child, and you're doing your damnedest to get everything that you can together for that child. So, quite often when we think about ACEs, we think about a really dysfunctional family, right? That's not necessarily the case when somebody's living in poverty. But the other key thing that's come out of some very interesting research that was, I think, was first published back in 2007 out of behavioral economics, is that the stress of poverty itself reduces our cognitive capacity in key ways. And you can see this not just in people of low SES. Take somebody from a high SES and give them a potential scenario where they have to, let's say, pay for a car repair that they don't have insurance for, and it's going to cost $8,000 or something, right? Well, for somebody who's living in the lowest quartile, that's, well, I guess I'm not going to repair the car, right? But for somebody who's above that, but where 8,000 is still a lot of money, what you can actually see is a cognitive load that occurs. Suddenly they're thinking very, very short term. They're not able to put that long-term planning into place. And so scarcity, I guess, rather than poverty, can affect all of us in very similar ways. So the other, challenge with SES and poverty is that not only does that cause financial strain and more stress for parents, it sometimes goes hand in hand with things like domestic violence, because that's also sensitive to the stress in the family. What if families fight about? Parents, they fight about money a lot. But we also know that people with adverse childhood experiences in their backgrounds, if they're not if they don't potentially achieve as high of an educational level, maybe not as well employed as somebody else, those also put financial strain. So it's a bit of a complex web there with poverty, but it absolutely does play a role. But I also just want to say that just because you're poor doesn't mean that your family's highly dysfunctional as well.
Thanks. That distinction makes sense. Thank you. So we're also interested, the group is really interested in how the Brain Builders certification is actually accessed and who should be certified. How can teachers and social workers apply this to their work? Because that's the challenge. Like, we hear this amazing information. How do we apply it? How do we really move forward?
Well, so my former employer, the Palix Foundation, of course, has that course freely available on their Alberta Family Wellness Initiative website. All you have to do is go to albertafamilywellness.org, I believe, and click on the training link. It's completely free. Anyone can register, move through that course. There are a number of tools that you can potentially access on that website to give you some ideas as well of how different organizations in Alberta have been applying this information. So little vignettes from different social service agencies. There's one from the Kainai High School on the Blood Reserve in Southern Alberta, talking about some of what they were doing. The foundation has also done a couple of developmental evaluations, which are available on their website, which have, the evaluation was about the foundation's role in creating the change, but there are also some examples in there about how people are potentially using this information. But the other thing I would say is, you guys have a treasure trove of people yourselves in Simcoe-Muskoka region who are part of the Brain Builders Lab initiative that was brought forward by the Canadian Centre on Substance Misuse and Addiction. And they are incredible resources. People like Jennifer Lloyd and Claudia Svoboda and all of those other folks. There were other key brain builders who were part, maybe not of the Simcoe-Muskoka District Health Unit group, but we're also working in Simcoe-Muskoka. And so I would encourage you to contact your local champions to talk about this as well. And I think the CCSA is going to be publishing a case book. Well, I don't have that confirmed yet, but a case book of examples of 25 sites across Canada who were applying this science in different ways across different organizations. And so once that's out, all of your local brain builders will have a copy and you can access that as well for ideas.
Thank you. And just so everybody knows, we will have, I believe Lauren is going to put this into the chat and it will be emailed out following the webinar. Just a list of relevant resources and links in case you didn't have a pen handy. So lots of information to follow, lots of good information. Do you have any final words, Dr. Sherren?
Only that it's been wonderful to see the enthusiasm in this region. You know, having done this work for a little over a decade in Alberta and seeing some of the huge shifts that are happening there, it's so amazing to see sort of the innovations that other jurisdictions are now coming up with when they think about their own local problems and how to address them. I've really enjoyed being connected with the region because I've learned a lot from you guys, and looking forward to continuing to connect and hear about your journey in the months and years to come.
Thank you so much. On behalf of the Simcoe-Muskoka Opioid Strategy, the City of Barrie, Georgian College, I want to thank you. This presentation was incredible and I'm always fascinated. You find it easy, I think, to just make these very high-level scientific concepts tangible and understandable for all of us. So I'm so grateful. And there's a huge impact, I think, when we can really understand. And I also want to thank all of our participants. We had so many busy people from across our region join us today and learn, and we're delighted to continue this conversation moving forward with all of you. Please keep in touch, and thank you again. And the information that we were going to share has been put in the chat. So enjoy the rest of your days, be well, stay safe, and thank you so much.